Thanks for joining us. I'm Ken Mingus, Executive Editor at Computer World. I'm here today with Lucian Constantine from CSO to talk about ransomware, trends about what's going on, maybe some of the things that companies should keep in mind if they are attacked, and what they can do about it. So, Lucian, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
I
Always a
just
pleasure to
wonder,
talk.
yes, it is. It's great to see you. I just wonder if, real quick, we should give a very basic definition of ransomware. I mean, obviously, you know what it is. You write about it. I know what it is. But for anybody that may be watching us at this event, they may have only a vague idea of how ransomware is defined these days. So when we talk about ransomware, what are we talking about?
So, as the name implies, basically, we are talking about software, malicious software that uses a ransom-based model. So they either, back in the day, the earliest forms were they were locking your computer screen, and you could not use the computer until you paid whatever money they requested. After that, and what's very common nowadays, and pretty much maybe 99% of ransomware is file encrypting ransomware, where once it infects your computer, it uses cryptographic algorithms to encrypt the files with a key that only the attackers have, and they ask you for money if you want to receive that key, or the decryptor, a software that has the key and decrypts your files, basically. So it's a way to blackmail people.
Got it. Exactly. You're right. It's like corporate blackmail. Well, let me ask you, obviously we've talked about this in the past when you and I have talked about security issues, and it's always like sort of a cat and mouse game between companies trying to protect their data and corporate secrets and, business processes and everything else. And the bad actors, the bad guys who are always trying to get in there and, either, demand money or cause mischief or whatever. How has ransomware evolved? We were talking a little bit beforehand about the whole idea of human versus bot, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that's one of the things a lot of people are interested in is how this has evolved and where it may be going over the next few years. So in terms of the things you've been reporting on, what are you seeing?
So when it started, ransomware was targeting everything basically, but mostly consumers, because attackers wanted to cast a very wide net and get as many victims as possible. But after the NotPetya and WannaCry incidents, where those were ransomware worms, which is they basically spread themselves automatically by exploiting certain vulnerabilities. And when attackers saw how successful those were, then we started seeing more and more groups targeting organizations and businesses in particular, or government institutions, because their IT tends to be a little bit more outdated. So now some of the most successful groups, or most of the most successful groups, are only targeting businesses, and they do their homework. They basically look at the company to decide the ransom amount. So it's not the same ransom amount for everyone. It might be a different ransom amount for different companies based on what they do and based on how many computers they have. And we'll get into that. The transition from malware that does things automatically, where they have a routine to infect computers, they have a routine to check for antivirus and all that things and disable them, and then infect and then display a ransom message, to a more APT nation state style attacks, where the attacker gets into the network initially through some other malware, more commodity malware, or to phishing, or to a vulnerability, or to exposed RDP credentials or weak RDP credentials. And then they use manual hacking techniques to do what the industry calls lateral movement. So they try to identify the domain controllers, and they try to obtain domain administrator credentials. And most penetration testers will tell you that that's very likely. So I haven't heard many penetration testers, which are professionals doing this, testing company networks, where they said, no, we couldn't get the domain administrator account. In some way, one way or another, you can do that. And once they do that, then they wait. So basically, from the initial point of entry, initial point of compromise, until they actually unleash the ransomware, which happens very fast if they have domain admin, they can push it to all the computers at once and basically encrypt everything, and then you just wake up, all my computers are infected. It can take months. So they sit inside your network, they slowly move laterally, they learn about your workflows, they map your network, they map your computers, your infrastructure, so they know what they're doing. And they're using all of these techniques that, like I said, used to be associated with APT groups, with nation-state cyber espionage attacks, where they're using tools that system administrators use, like PowerShell, like PCXec, which is a Windows utility, or open source tools, which are dual use, that are also used by system administrators when they do this manual hacking to steal credential, Mimikatz, and all those other tools, which is much harder to detect with traditional antivirus type products. You need CM, log analysis, behavioral analysis at the network level. You need more visibility to detect these types of attacks, and they're much harder to protect against. And yes, that's why some of these groups are very, very successful.
I wanted to ask because you make a good point there that there's a time lag between the time that they're able to access the network and sort of sniff around and find out what it is that they need before they spring the trap, as it were. And I just wonder for companies, is that an opportunity if a company is doing its security properly, that maybe they can sniff out that they've been hacked, or that there's been a vulnerability here, and they might be able to stop them before they actually spring the trap and encrypt everything? Is there a time frame there that companies should really be really focused on?
Certainly. So there are some common ways through which ransomware spreads. One of it is phishing employees. We had quite a recent case, like a couple of weeks ago, of a ransomware targeting mid-level employees in companies in Europe, which is through malicious attachment. You open the attachment, you get infected, then they have a foothold. Another common way is companies exposing remote access through RDP or other protocols and having weak credentials, not using two-factor authentication and things like that. And what happens in the cybercrime ecosystem is that various cybercriminal groups offer various types of services. So you have groups that their only job is to hack publicly exposed computers or internet exposed servers, and then they have like a marketplace where they sell access. So as a different, like a ransomware group can go there and say, I want servers from these particular companies, or only corporate servers, and that they pay for that access, and that gives them access into your network. And then you have obviously vulnerabilities in various server software that's left unpatched, that's exposed to the internet, web servers, web frameworks, that sort of things, appliances, devices, and the attack surface is like quite large, right? And then you have the commodity malware, because, for example, one of the most successful groups, actually two of them, Ryuk, RYUK, which probably many people are familiar with because it's been on the news a lot over the past 2 years. Their malware is distributed, where not their malware, the access they gain is almost exclusively through a botnet called TrickBot, which in its turn it's distributed by another botnet called Emotet. And these are what the industry would call commodity malware. They are spam botnets. They are quite common, and they spread, as you might expect, through spam email and all of those other things. And not all TrickBot infections will lead to Ryuk, because the Ryuk gang is very selective in the type of companies they want to target, but some of them will. So if you have an infection with a commodity malware, say TrickBot or Emotet, or in the case of another group called DoppelPaymer, they use Dridex, which is another botnet. So this commodity malware infections, you might say, oh, okay, I solved it. I just fixed it on this computer that got infected. But by that time, these groups might already be on a network, and they have already spread out by using manual hacking techniques. And now they have credentials, they're moving into your network from server to server. So don't ignore commodity malware. Or if you find like a TrickBot infection, investigated properly, and that means you need to have visibility, you need to have log collection, you need to have those extra things, not just antivirus. And it's a question of threat modeling. That's the problem, basically, because let's be honest, not every company will be able to do that. These types of more advanced protections used to be for large enterprises, companies in certain industries targeted by cyber espionage groups. Not everyone has APTs on their threat model. Not everyone sees themselves as targets for cyber espionage. But as we've seen with Ryuk and these gangs, you've had like attorney offices being affected, small medical clinics, and causing a lot of disruptions on targets that are not reasonable. It's not reasonable to expect an attorney's office to have CM products or like this type of network level visibility. So it's hard. I mean, no one's saying it's easy to do these things. What you should do is have secure storage, have backup capabilities, and have file integrity checking mechanism. If there are now whitelisting solutions, so the applications that you're running on your computer should be whitelisted. You shouldn't be able to run anything else without the administrator approving it. Users running with the lowest possible privilege that they require to do their job and nothing more. Administrators not leaving local admin credentials on the local computer, using local admin accounts. And obviously Microsoft has a whole documentation. NIST now, NIST has put out guidance for companies on how to respond to ransomware, detect and protect themselves against ransomware, and then respond to ransomware. Because with ransomware, as with APT groups, you should start from the premise that you are going to get compromised sooner or later, right? So you should have a proper response in place with proper backups, with cybersecurity insurance if you want, and all those other things that are important for you to put your business back on track immediately, like the business continuity plan that you need to have in place.
We were talking about that a little while ago, the idea that comes up, should a company pay, and the point you made, and I think it's a smart one, is that it really depends on how much you're being, whether you're sure you're dealing with the real person or a real group that has hacked the company and has encrypted your data. But also, do you have a business continuity plan in place? Can you afford to pay the ransomware? And the problem is we don't really know a lot about how companies respond because you made the point that a lot of this is, these are private companies and they don't necessarily have to broadcast that they've been attacked and what they did to get out of it. So, I mean, back to my question, what should a company do if they're hit?
So security professionals or security experts don't recommend paying the ransom because this just encourages and keeps this model of cybercrime going. But also we have to be realistic and understand that, and even the FBI, for example, they clearly say that some companies pay, and they're not recommending them to pay, but they can't stop them either because, I mean, the loss from downtime could be much more than, refusing to pay if you don't have the proper backup mechanisms and backup restoration. Because what I've heard from security people over the years is that a company might have a backup process in place, but then when they get hit, they might realize that restoring data from backup, because they never tested it, might take much longer than just paying the whatever amount of money, and then they decide to pay because it's quicker just to use the program provided and the encryption key provided by the attackers than to restore from their own backups, even if they have them. So that shouldn't happen. On the other hand, we now have changes in the model where ransomware groups don't only encrypt your files and ask for a ransom, they're doubling down by stealing your data and threatening to release it if you don't pay the ransomware. Some people call that a double extortion, but it's not double in the sense that they're asking for two separate two separate sums of money, one for the file restoration and one for not publishing the files on the internet, so preventing the data leak. I think there's only one group that does that, actually, the true double extortion, but it's a way to reinforce your initial extortion, their initial extortion, where they're saying, okay, not only, okay, you might have a backup, but if you don't pay, we're gonna release your files, whatever we copied from your network, and now the company is facing a data leak, a public data leak with sensitive information, either intellectual property, partner information, their customer information, and all that, which can be pretty bad for a company. So that might encourage even more victims to pay. And now we have groups, on top of that, we have groups who are setting up auction site on the internet. So even if you refuse to pay and not, if you don't give in to the data leak threat, and there are groups now that still want to benefit from that effort and that data, and they're setting up auction sites with those companies' data, and they're holding them up as examples. These guys didn't want to pay. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to put the data up for auction, and whoever is interested can buy it. So it's becoming increasingly difficult for companies to say no if they're unprepared. And not only companies, obviously government institutions. We've had police departments, school districts, medical clinics, hospitals, and all those types of institutions that can't afford to be down.
Right. It's really interesting because the way you describe this, and I think we sort of have talked about this when we've talked about ransomware in the past, but it's like this. I keep getting this image in my mind of like the bazaar from Casablanca. You've got this whole underworld of actors. As you say, the people who break in, the people who launch the threat, the people who are now dealing with trying to sell the data. And it's like a free-for-all out there. Is there anything that governments or law enforcement can do to try to break these things up? Or is it, are they able to stay sort of just ahead of like the authorities?
There is, I'm not going to say there's no law enforcement action, and obviously various gangs have been identified over the years, both ransomware gangs and other cyber criminals, even very advanced ones like the Karbonite group, which was doing a similar thing, but was stealing money from banks and financial institutions, like breaking into their networks, understanding their workflows, and walking away with large sums of money, and even central banks, which is wow. I mean, it's a lot. Yes, but those investigations take a very, very long time, and they're not necessarily always successful, depending on how well, or they might manage to break a chain in that, like a link in that chain, but that link can be replaced by some other supplier, right? So if I'm buying access from a botnet and they take down that botnet, I can go and buy access from a different botnet, right? So it's a never-ending. That's how the internet has evolved and the cybercrime underground has evolved. You're never going to be able to take it down entirely. You might dismantle certain pieces of it. Some of them could be very serious blows for the moment for the cybercrime underground, but they tend to spring those back up. Other groups, a thing with this like human-operated ransomware groups is that they kind of diverge from that model, or where you had like a ransomware creator, developer, the person who wrote the code. Then that person used to work with sellers, and those sellers would go on forums and market that product, the ransomware, to other cyber criminals. And then you have other affiliates. So it was like a kind of an affiliate, every person doing their own thing. So it was like an economic ecosystem, basically. But these groups, what they've did, like Ryuk, the Ryuk gang, and because people now suspect that the TrickBot.net is actually also under their control. It's just that they only distribute the ransomware to interesting targets, but the entire botnet is also owned by them. So they kind of brought all of those tasks in-house. They no longer buy access from other people. They no longer rely on others to sell them. They're the only one who control the Ryuk ransomware. It's not a ransomware as a service, like other ransomware products. It's their own product, only they can use it. It's very specialized. They are handling the manual hacking aspects of it. So it's a group that has all this talent inside of it, all these people who can do this stuff, which is rare, used to be rarer in the cybercrime. That's why I'm comparing to nation state cyber espionage groups, where they are building these groups with a lot of talent, different people doing very good at doing different tasks. You have the malware developers, you have the attackers, the exploiters, the red teamers, the penetration testers, and people with vulnerability knowledge. That's switching to the cybercrime aspect, which is kind of worrying, because as more and more such groups come along, it's increasingly difficult for companies to defend themselves, especially for medium-sized companies, not the large enterprises.
Yeah, I can understand that the larger companies, if they're smart, theoretically would have security measures in place. Smaller companies are so small that they're likely to sort of escape notice unless there's something really unusual about them. And therefore, it's almost like protection by obscurity, security by obscurity. But you got the companies in the middle that have, a fairly prominent public persona, if you will, which makes them a target, but they may not have the resources of an IBM, an Apple, and Microsoft, or whatever to try to guard against these things. So in terms of those sort of middle tier companies that are maybe most in danger here, are there things that they can be doing? I mean, we've talked about some of the things about watching the network and whitelisting, et cetera, but are there things that they should or could be doing as we sort of look over the next year or 2 or 3 as this evolves to try to head this off?
Many of those companies, including the small ones and the mid-sized companies, they tend to outsource their security management and maybe IT management in general, right, to companies that specialize in this. And now we have many MSSPs, managed security services providers, which have a security operations center. Why? Because there's a skills shortage in the security industry. So it's very hard for those medium-sized companies to even find the talent to build like a proper large enough security team. They might have one person doing security, and that one person might also be the IT administrator or something. For larger companies, what Microsoft actually recommends is that because these hacks happen by exploiting this lateral movement type of activity, happens by exploiting mistakes or habits that administrators are used to and they need to change. Microsoft recommends embedding the IT admins into the security teams, because in many large corporations, these tend to be separate. You have the security team and you have the IT management team, and Microsoft advises like embedding IT people, IT management people into the security teams so they understand those things. For the smaller companies, as I said, you have the ability to outsource. But you have to be very careful, because another trend is that ransomware gangs are now targeting managed services providers. And I don't think managed security services providers are out of the question. They might have a better security because that's what they do, the security. But we've had cases of managed IT services providers being compromised. And this does not mean these service providers are not necessarily handling your entire IT management, but maybe they handle a certain aspect of it, a certain service that you need. And you need to be careful, because these groups are going after those companies because those companies can provide them with access to all of those companies tend to have access into the networks of their customers because they need to manage stuff. So if those get compromised, then they become an internal threat for you, because that legitimate access can be abused to get into your network, and it's a legitimate access, and it's even harder it's not unauthorized. That connection is supposed to happen, so it's even harder to protect against it, which means you should apply the principles of least privilege, and those people who connect into your network, partners, vendors, services providers, should have only the most limited access they need to do their job. and that access should be monitored. They should look at that and see if there's anything weird, if there are connections at odd hours after regular working hours, which probably shouldn't happen unless it's an emergency, right? So yeah, I mean that's probably how companies are handling that.
It's interesting too, and I mean, lots of insights here. We could talk about this for hours. So I'll leave you with this last question. You see a lot these days about the sort of the merger of AI and ML, machine learning, with security. And you were just talking about, one of the things companies can do and should do is be looking for unusual activity on the network. Somebody that shouldn't have access that seems to be doing something that they shouldn't be doing, weird timing, things like that. Have you seen any signs that things like artificial intelligence and machine learning built into network security or overall security might be a way to sort of keep an eye on things for companies that may not be paying as much attention as they should?
Sure. One thing where machine learning can help, what people call AI, but it's basically machine learning and machine learning models, a way to analyze big data, a lot of data, and apply a model to it, and is in triaging, filtering alerts, because all these products like log analysis, logging and log analysis, network traffic analysis, and all these other products tend to generate a lot of alerts, which can overwhelm a security team. Even in large enterprises, you have cases where there's a huge backlog of security alerts that no one has ever or has yet to check, because you have limited resources. And you need a way to prioritize those alerts, right? And that's where these machine learning algorithms and models can help, where you can assign different scores to different types of abnormalities, and then the entire alert gets put higher or lower. And this sort of triage of security alerts can be very helpful. But companies need to also be the AI thing and machine. I'm not saying security companies, they're not vendors out there who use machine learning in a very good way, or artificial intelligence. But there's also a lot of hype and a lot of people throw the AI around, the AI term around, just because they want to have it in their press release. And we are now using AI. Not everything is like solved with AI. It used to happen like with the blockchain. Everything was now on the blockchain. Now everything is with AI. There are very good use cases for security, especially in data analysis, as I've said. And also, I know of cases where companies, I wrote a story about Visa, but Visa is a very large company with a lot of resources. They built an entire container monitoring solution, because now all of their services run in public clouds, in different clouds, in containers. The microservice architecture that's now very popular. And there are not many solutions out there to monitor things in containers, and they built their own container monitoring solution with a machine learning agent model and agent on the back end, which they built themselves. And they trained it on their very, very large data sets, millions and millions and hundreds of millions of events going off every minute, transactions and all that sort of stuff. But obviously, you need a data scientist to do that. I mean, not everyone can do it, but it's doable. Their argument was that we know our environment better than any vendor, and we can build a solution that's very tailored to our needs, instead of buying a solution that might have a ton of features that we'll never use, just to get that feature set, that small feature set that we need. And then we need to train people to use that product, and we need to make sure it works correctly with what we have. So they decided to build it from scratch, which is very cool. And there are now open source frameworks out there, TensorFlow and all that, that people can learn to use and build models with. But you need the talent. I mean, you need the resources to do that, right? It's not something a small company will be able to do, unless it's a startup that's building something specifically with machine learning. So I think it's going to be useful in the long term, especially on the cloud-based analysis, data analysis type thing. But yeah, companies should be careful about vendor pitches. But I mean, that's true in general. There's always
Of
a lot like
course.
next
Yeah.
generation, whatever. Not everything
Yeah.
is next generation, right?
Not everything is new and improved. And,
Yeah.
it does sound like in terms of ransomware and what companies are dealing with, that clearly this is going to be sort of a case of whack-a-mole that we're all going to be dealing with for the foreseeable future. But it really, I just wanted to thank you. Lots of insights here about what companies should be paying attention to, the kinds of things that are going on out there right now. And whenever we talk about this stuff, I always feel smarter, Lucian. So thank you so much for being here and talking about
Sure,
this.
of course. And one other thing I wanted
Yes.
to mention is
Yeah.
that AI can help create better products or better security products, but we will likely over time see machine learning used in attacks as well. So there's that side of things. AI is not only for defenders, and machine learning is not only for defenders, that it's also for the attackers. So I'm curious to see what we'll do then when we have machine learning enhanced attacks, basically, or attacks that mutate themselves based on what they see automatically. So yeah, I mean,
As long as these things don't become sentient, I think
yeah.
we'll probably, the battle will go on. But that's a good point. And it's true. Again, we could talk about this forever, but it's very clear. Every tactic that companies use to protect themselves can be turned around by attackers and used to attack, the systems that are in place. Good points. Really, really great
Sure.
insights, Lucian. Thank you so much, and thank you everybody for watching. I hope you enjoyed this little tour of ransomware, where we are and where we may be going.